may have heard me talk about API before, or maybe you've heard way before me somewhere this API thing being called, and you never really quite understood what that is. Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface. Now again, you may see, okay, what does that really mean? That doesn't really quite help much, right? Well, if you look at an application, it doesn't have to be a mobile application. It can be any application that you build, right? In this case, this application, let's suppose that it needs to connect remotely to get information, right? So the application itself is the front part of the whole process. There's a lot of things that happen behind for the application to actually work. In this case here, the application, the part that we see, the part that users can actually interact with, it's just the interface part of things. Meaning that below that level, we should have some sort of what we call the API. Again, this application programming interface. And below that, we have what we call the backend server. So essentially here, what we're trying to say is that if you look thoroughly, you will say that we have that application and we have the backend server, which has all of the database and all the things that allow the database to actually be created and the data to be stored. Now, in order for our application here on the left to be able to get information, get the data that it needs from the backend, it can directly just go and fetch that data. In fact, it can. But the best way to do that, to simplify this process, we need to have what we call an API, this application programming interface. So now the middle here, this application programming interface, it is indeed what connects the application with the backend. Now, this transaction here that happens, you notice it's not just one direction, it is bi-directional here, so it goes back and forth because you can also send things from application to the back end. But in this case here, we're talking about getting stuff from the back end. So it has to be through an API. Now, this API, it is indeed what allows us to see the JSON, XML. Those are just formats that when application says, hey, I need something from the backend. The backend is already set up to send that information back to us, but in a format that is easier for the application to be able to consume, or in this case, to parse. So the formats in which the API sends this information could be JSON, XML, and there's so many other formats out there. But the JSON and XML, mainly JSON, is the one that it's used the most. Okay, so think of this API here as the middleman between the application and the backend server. Now, you may also have heard me or you've seen people say, for instance, well, in order to learn Android development, you have to understand the Android APIs. What does that mean? Well, it means the same thing that we're talking about here, but now it's not in terms of the networking, the backend server as we're talking about here. What we're talking about here when somebody says, for instance, you have to learn Android APIs, what they're saying really is that you have to learn the documentation of Android classes, of Android software development kit. API in this sense, it still is application programming interface, but now we're talking about learning about, for instance, activity class. What does activity class do? How do we use the activity class in order for us to actually create a window or a screen where users can actually start interacting with the application? And still, even with that explanation here, you can still understand that API in any context doesn't have to be in networking or doesn't have to be Android, doesn't have to be anything. In any context, it's just a way in which developers or the front end of anything is able to connect with what is the underlying system that we're trying to connect with or work with. Okay? Very good. So now that we understand that, we need to understand how to consume remote APIs. Well, in order to consume remote APIs in code, we need to understand a lot of things. We need to understand about cache. We need to understand about using HTTP networking classes. And there's so much that goes under the hood. Now, we can, of course, create our own classes leveraging the underlying classes that the Android SDK provides for us, which is still simplified if you think about it, but we'll still have to think a little bit more and do a little bit more work to be able to actually parse data that comes in from our server or remote server, or an API for that matter, okay? Now, all of that, it is complicated. So if that's complicated, why do we even do that? Why even bother to write those classes ourselves if we can find other ways to do that by using libraries? Right. So we can actually leverage what's already created. So we can actually use something that very smart folks have already put together, such as the Android SDK. Right? If you think about it, the Android SDK, it is indeed a library per se, okay? The engineers who created the Android were able to use Java and other languages to create this amazing library of classes and packages that we can just understand how to use Java and then invoke the APIs. Oh, I hope I'm not confusing you here, right? To use all of those classes so that we can just create our applications, abstracting everything out. So in this case here, we need to understand what is a library. Well, I just told you really. A library is just something that has been taken away all of its complexity. Okay? So if we are able to create a class that takes away the complexity of doing something, and we publish that class so that people can just have that class in a library, in a package, and then leverage that by calling methods and so forth to get things done quicker, that is indeed what a library is. So you will now probably start thinking, okay, in that case, even Android itself, any framework or platform that we can use to build something, to do something, it is indeed a library in a sense of the word in this case, right? Because a lot of things have been abstracted out. All of that complexity is out of the sight now, and so we can just focus on doing something that we actually want to do. Now, there are a lot of network libraries out there. We are going to be using Valley library to go and fetch data online through an API and then show that on our application. All right, let's go ahead and put it all in practice.